Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Anchorage to the Joint Protocol Committee meeting of the North Pacific Fishery Management Council and the Alaska Board of Fisheries. I'm John Jensen, Chairman of the Alaska Board of Fisheries Joint Protocol Committee. Today is Thursday, October 13th, 2022, and it's 8:30 a.m. With me today is Mr. Mesereau, who serves as the chair of the council side of the Joint Protocol Committee. And for anyone here that may have hearing difficulties or something, talk to the people down here at the end of the table. They could provide a hearing device for you if you need that. And also, it's a good time to remind everybody to turn your ringers off on your cell phones. There are six committee members present, and with that, I'll start with it. I'll let the members introduce themselves, and I'll start with Mr. Down.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Kenny Down. I'm a voting member on the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council. I'm appointed as a representative for industry from Washington State. Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. My name is Marit Carlson Van Dort. I'm a member of the Alaska Board of Fisheries and reside here in Anchorage. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Dave Witherell, North Pacific Fishery Management Council Executive Director.
Good morning, Andy Mesereau, voting member, North Pacific Fishery Management Council, reside in Seward, where I'm a charter boat operator and IFQ shareholder there.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. My name is Art Nelson. I'm the Executive Director for the Board of Fisheries.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. My name is Angel Drobnica. I'm a voting member of the North Pacific Fishery Management Council, and I reside in Juneau.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. I'm Mike Heimbuck, member of the Board of Fisheries, newest appointee, and I live in Homer.
Mr. Nelson.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. We also have two board support staff here this morning, Henry Legia and Farie Sylvester, down at the end of the table.
Thank you, Mr. Nelson. With that, we'll go into the, in order to ensure that the public is fully informed of the committee process, either myself, my fellow co-chair, or executive directors may assist you. In accordance with the State of Alaska's Open Meeting Act, the board staff issued a notice for this meeting. Similarly, the council has published a notice of the meeting in the Federal Register. Copies of these notices are available from the executive directors for those who are interested in the complete text. Public comments were solicited, and committee members have received copies of all written public comments. Public comments are available for the public in the workbooks on the table in the back of the room. And with that, we will start with the agenda we have before us for today. We're looking forward on number 2, executive director reports. Mr. Nelson, do you have a...
Happy to give you a brief report. Yesterday, we helped facilitate the Alaska Bycatch Review Task Force meeting. We're just about to kick off the full cycle for the Board of Fish on our winter meeting schedule that begins with our work session on October 25 and 26, followed by our PCOD meeting, which is October 27 and 28. Those will be down here, downstairs at the Egan Center. We also have our Bristol Bay Finfish meeting November 29 through December 3rd, AYK Finfish meeting January 14 through 18, Alaska Peninsula, Aleutian Islands, and Chignik Finfish, February 20 through 25, and wrapping up with our statewide and supplemental issues meeting March 10 through 13. We do have some groundfish and some Dungeness crab agenda change requests on our work session schedule, so stakeholders might want to pay attention to those. However, action that the board takes at the work session is just whether to accept an agenda change request or not. And if it is accepted, then it's scheduled for action at a future meeting. Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Nelson. I have to finish reading my intro into the meeting here. I skipped the page here. Copies of tentative agenda for this meeting can be found on the table in the back of the room. The plan today is to run through a series of staff reports on a number of topics. These are important subject matters, and I look forward to a robust conversation between the two bodies as we contemplate the information. At the end of the staff report, we'll have an opportunity for a QA of the staff. Following the staff reports, we'll have an opportunity for public comment. I'll explain the process for the public comment in a moment. After we complete the public comment period, I'll ask committee to discuss the subjects before us. While the committee is not empowered to take any action, if anyone wishes to compel the committees to take an advisory position on an issue, I encourage the question and discussion that follows. In the Board of Fisheries process, we're accustomed to take public comment throughout the meeting with what we call record copies. This committee does not need this level of formality, but I want to encourage the public that if you have information you wish to committee, please submit it. Unlike the board's process, I'll waive the page limit for this requirement. And normally on the Board of Fish, we have a page limit for public comments during the meetings. Anyone attending this meeting who would like to submit written materials to the committee for its consideration must give 12 copies of the written materials to our record keeper, who's at the end of the table to my right. It's the responsibility of the person that's submitting the materials to make the copies. The original of all written materials submitted will be retained for permanent record of the committee. The record keeper will distribute copies of the document at the first practical break. If those of you who wish to testify must fill out a blue card, which is found on the back table, and submit it to the staff on my right at the end of the table. Let's see. We will leave this open until close of the agenda item 3 for signing the blue cards. Please write clearly when you sign up. We will set the time limit of 3 minutes for public testimony. And let's see. Okay, so I jumped ahead. So now we're starting with the formal agenda. So, Mr. Witherall, do you have an executive director report?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to welcome everyone here and remind you all what the purpose of the Joint Protocol Committee is, and that's to provide more coordination in the management of federal and state waters across fishery lines. As you know, we share the management of Pacific cod fisheries, for example, in state and federal waters, and other fisheries, including sablefish. We also have several joint fishery management plans where there's federal authority and state authority under that plan, including our Bering Sea and Aleutian Island Crab Fishery Management Plan, FMP, the Scallop FMP, and our Salmon FMP. And as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, at our last meeting, we went over the federal actions that we're going to establish fishery management in the EEZ of Cook Inlet under our Salmon FMP. And we'll probably be revisiting that at a future meeting. But in this meeting, you're going to hear staff reports on Bering Sea and Aleutian Island crab and management and status, and Pacific cod, both in the Gulf of Alaska and the Bering Sea. And hear about a recent council action that was taken just last week relative to providing additional opportunities for small boats to harvest cod in the Bering Sea. Now, I have a number of staff here in the room to help out, and I'll just read through the names, and they'll introduce themselves when they come up to give their presentations. But here with us, we have Sarah Rhinesmith, John McCracken, Dr. Kate Hoppola, Anna Henry, Dr. Diana Stram, Sarah LaBelle, Clay McKean, and Nicole Watson in the audience. So we have plenty of staff ready to assist if you have any questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Witherall. With that, we'll start our agenda, and we'll take a staff report on crab issues, status of the Bering Sea crab stocks, Bristol Bay Red King crab, Bering Sea snow crab, and Bering Sea tanner crab, the Department of Fish and Game. Are you ready, Mark?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, council members, or committee members. My name is Mark Stickert. I work for Alaska Department of Fish and Game, Commercial Fisheries Division, as a regional shellfish, groundfish management coordinator based in Kodiak. So I'll start us off today by giving a high elevation review of Bering Sea crab stock status. So a fairly diverse audience here, so I think I'll start this conversation by a quick review of the federal and state reference points that we use for management. Obviously, I think we're all familiar with the overfishing level. The OFL is a level of fishing mortality that jeopardizes the capacity of a stock to produce a measure of sustained yield on a continuing basis. Below the OFL is the ABC. The ABC is a level of annual catch that accounts for the uncertainty and the science and is set to prevent the OFL from being exceeded. In practice, the ABC limits mortality of all male and female crab, regardless of size, from all sources of fishing mortality. So from the retained catch and from bycatch and other fisheries, non-directed crab and groundfish fisheries. So both the OFL and the ABC are federal responsibilities and ultimately have oversight by the council. And then you'll see the TAC. The TAC is the annual catch target for the directed fishery set to prevent exceeding the ABC for that stock. Crab fisheries are unique in that they are size and sex-specific fisheries, and so in practice, the TAC limits the retainable amount of legal or preferred size male crab, but it must consider all sources of mortality to ensure that the ABC is not exceeded. So with that in mind, I'll just jump straight ahead to the specification summary for all 6 Bering Sea crab stocks. You'll note in the red box below the 3 larger stocks, Bristol Bay red king crab, Bering Sea tanner crab, and Bering Sea snow crab will be my focus for most of the talk. This is a sobering table this year. The 3 crab stocks to the north, Pribilof red and blue, and St. Matthew blue king crab, all remain closed. Bristol Bay red king crab is closed again for a second year. We'll see a small tanner crab fishery this year, Bairdi, and for the first time, we'll see a full closure of Bering Sea snow crab. So moving forward into snow crab, here's just the assessment specifications pulled right out of this year's SAFE report. There was an OFL of about 23 million pounds, an ABC of about 17 million pounds. I'll note here that this stock is still declared overfished. Current stock status is about 23% of long-term average, and the projected stock status for this year puts us at around 30% stock status. So what this means in terms of animals, this first figure shows you the NOAA area swept information from the summer survey for mature male biomass, and we're defining mature males here as every male crab that is greater than 95 millimeters in carapace width. And you'll notice looking at the 2022 line, we've been in a trend of declines, and 2022 from the survey data is the lowest point in the time series. So we're at a fairly critically low biomass of mature males. Looking at mature females here, and we'll define mature female based on abdomen morphology. Again, a little more noise in the signal, but the trend remains the same, continuing declines in mature female biomass. And while not the lowest in the time series, it is the 3rd lowest measure of mature female biomass in the time series, and you have to go back to 1985 and 86 before we see lower numbers. So this is just total mature biomass. This is an important measure in the state system, an important consideration for the TAC. And again, this is just the previous 2 slides added together. And I'll note here that total mature biomass for snow crab in the Bering Sea is at 21% of the long-term average, meaning this year's abundance estimate divided by the long-term average puts us at 21%. So this is important, and this feature is what the state used to establish the fishery closure this year. This cartoon here is just a quick snapshot of the state harvest strategy. Details aren't really important here, but we use a sliding control rule where exploitation ranges between 22.5% and down to 10%. As abundance declines, you move down this control rule, and then you hit this red box. And then you'll see there that the long-term average of total mature biomass, when it drops below 25%, it prompts the fishery to close. And this was the specific feature this year that resulted again in the closure. So I think we've seen a lot of information leading up to now and talking about what happened and why we're here. A large point of conversation and a lot of consideration during the state's process to close the fishery. We're really trying to look ahead a little bit and think about what comes next and what impacts we might cause now by opening or closing a fishery as it relates to at least the short-term future of the stock. And so I think it might be helpful to just talk about the last 4 years and characterize what the stock was doing since 2018. And it's really an example of extremes. So the figure on the right is just a length frequency histogram where you see size of crab on the bottom. So from left to right, small to large crab, and then just abundance in millions of crab. And each blue bar there just represents the number of crab in each, I think they're 5 millimeter size bins. So you'll see in the top figure there, and the red line is our definition of maturity. That's 95% or 95 millimeters or greater. So everything to the right of that we consider a mature crab and a part of the spawning biomass. These are bell crab. So you'll see in the top figure there that 2018 was a pretty exciting year. The survey yielded the highest point estimate for recruitment in the time history. This was an extremely encouraging sign. I think a lot of people saw a lot of optimism in this. I think there was a lot of investment and reinvestment in the fishery based on this expectation that we were seeing a very, very strong cohort coming through the system. Dropping below this box now, you'll see the same information for 2019.
Could you move your mic just a little bit closer? A little bit
Sure.
hard time
So
hearing.
the lower box shows you the same information for the 2019 survey. And to notice there, we saw a substantial decline in crab, mostly in these juvenile size classes, to the effect of 2.5 billion animals were missing from the population between 2018 and 2019. Obviously, a lot of alarm bells for staff looking at this. A lot of questions, not a lot of answers. Consideration where those crab died, did they move? Was this uncertainty in the survey estimate? But there were so many crab there that despite the net decrease from 2018 to 2019, we actually saw an increase in the number of mature animals in the population as this pulse had matured into maturity or transitioned into maturity. So I think the department took a cautious worldview, and we set a TAC around 28 million pounds based on the 2019 survey estimate. And again, that's a reflection that we actually saw an net increase in the number of mature animals, but clearly we recognize there was a lot of natural mortality happening for juvenile size classes. So moving forward a year, again, so now the top panel just shows the 2019 survey again, and then we had COVID. We didn't have a survey in 2020, so it was a bit of a black box. And then the lower box now just shows 2021. So again, you see another dramatic decline in biomass of crab, numbers of crab. Clearly there's poor recruitment. We aren't seeing any new crab entering the system. Continued decline in juvenile size classes of crab. This year we relied on model estimates to set ABC, OFL, and tax. We did have a sizable fishery because the general thought and the model was suggesting that that 2018 size class was still in the water, and we're continuing to contribute to the population. In retrospect, now we understand that natural mortality and fishing mortality was exceeding growth and recruitment. So there were more removals from the population than there were inputs by a substantial margin. And you'll see here that mature male biomass, unlike 2018 to 2019, declined from 120 to 54 million pounds. So again, significant loss of crab across all size classes. Catching up to today. So 2021 survey information, again, the top panel, 2022. Continuing to see that sort of 50 millimeter and above size class continue to dissipate. Again, we assume we're making the a judgment here that natural mortality and fishery mortality is again exceeding growth and recruitment, so more removals from the population than there are inputs. We saw a decline of mature male biomass of about 40% from the 2021 to 2020 survey, from 54 to 45 million pounds. So, 45 million pounds of mature male biomass for snow crab in the Bering Sea is it's a scary number, just to be clear. So leading into, so I guess I'll say then, one positive signal, as you can see in the bottom left-hand panel there, we're seeing a small blip of new small crab coming into the season, coming into the system here. We saw this both for males and females, and so some signs of optimism for the future. But really leading up to our decision to close the fishery this year, we were really trying to evaluate the effects on whether or not a fishery of any size, would that have a measurable or impact on sort of the future of this population. And model challenges again this year. So just relying on area swept information from the survey, we know that we lost 40% of mature male biomass. This translates into about 9 million pounds of mature crab that we're missing essentially from 2021 to 2022. We set a TAC of 5.5 million pounds last year. When you translate that to total fishery mortality, that scales up to about 8 million pounds. So maybe not unintuitive that you would think that we saw a 9 million pound decrease in biomass from one year to the next, and 8 million pounds of that could be explained by fishery mortality. That was an important consideration for us moving forward, with the expectation that perhaps making decisions to have a fishery this year might and could be the dominant factor on trajectory of the stock. And so this was a big warning signal to us. So I'm just going to zoom in here a little bit on the 2022 picture. So again, the dotted dash line is our definition of mature. Everything to the right of that is a mature male. Everything to the left is immature. We did see this positive signal in small crab. I'll note here that the scale, the abundance scale, the previous slides were, the top was 300 million and this one's 30 million. So massive declines in animals that are still in the water here. And so the question is, well, how long until these small crab hit maturity and likely start recontributing to expansion and growth of this population? And more importantly, what crab do we have to live with until that happens? So this comes from the stock assessment model that we saw from Cody Zawalski earlier this year. As you can see, this just shows you our expectation for how quickly crab might grow. So this is the growth increment between molts. I don't know if you can see my slide here, but if you look at sort of the range of dots around 60 millimeters on the bottom, it would suggest that each time one of these small crabs molt, we would expect somewhere between a 10 to 15 millimeter growth increment. I think we generally understand that crab of these size will molt once, maybe twice in a given year. And so projecting ourselves forward here, we would expect that these 50 millimeter crab here, that's a positive signal, we might be 3 or 4 years out before they hit maturity and start meaningfully contributing to regrowth of this population. And perhaps more importantly, the crab that we have, when that line bottoms out there at 60 millimeters, that's the crab we have for the next 5 years to supply the population here. So a real sign of precaution for us. So moving away from male crab here a little bit, there were a number of other troubling signals in the biology of the stock. This just shows you clutch fullness, so years on the bottom, and the vertical axis here just shows you the proportion of mature female crab that had clutches, that had eggs that were at least 3/4 full. Hard to interpret clutch fullness, a lot of noise in the signal, but again, we're seeing this all-time series low. So you can interpret here that 40% of all female mature crab that were sampled in the population had clutches that were less than 3/4 full. So some sign, or at least signal of reproductive failure here. So another troubling signal that led to some of our decision making this year. Here's some fish information from the fishery. This is just CPUE, catch per unit effort of 4-inch males during the fishery last year. We've seen a declining trend overall, some, again, noise in the signal in general, but again, the take-home line is looking at the blue retained catch line. Last year's fishery was at the lowest CPUE, at least in the rationalized time series. So that would generally instructs us that, you know, our perception of what's in the water isn't wrong. So the sense that the fishery isn't finding something that the assessment of the survey is not. So generally converging on common outcomes here. Again, so lowest in the rationalized time series. Here's the snow crab catch, weighted mean centers of catch. So, you know, where the fishery happened. You can see sort of in the cloud of centers of catch north and west of the Pribilof Islands that during, you know, historically during most years, catch is sort of centered around 57 degrees north. You'll see the northernmost point was the mean center of catch for 2020, and just below that is 2021. So still, you know, coincident to the large decline in numbers, we saw a shift in the total population to the north. And so, again, a little bit of speculation here, but I think we generally understand that when female crab release their larvae and they're in their pelagic phase, they generally get advected. They generally get carried to the north. The thought is those crabs settle out, and then as those juvenile crab transition to larger crab, they generally walk back down to the south. So this feedback loop. Some thought and some concern that, you know, a more northerly distributed population were essentially blowing larvae off the shelf or into the northern Bering Sea, which I think we understand is less productive for snow crab than the southern Bering Sea. So again, one more signal or general concern about, you know, the reproductive viability of the stock looking forward in the near future anyway. So overall, population of snow crab in the Bering Sea at historical lows. Future environmental conditions and snow crab recruitment is unknown. Some troubling signals there. I think we now well understand that this was a mortality event. You know, early on we were thinking maybe those crab had moved, looking for cold water, had walked off the shelf break or walked into Russia or walked the northern Bering Sea, but you know, we're 4 or 5 years into this event now, and I think those crab are gone. Still some movement, but likely this was a mortality event. Given the recent blip in recruitment that we saw of small crab, it would suggest that this mortality event is largely over. But in the near term, I think things are going to get worse before they get better for mature sized crab anyway. Just because, again, I think those small crab that we're seeing, giving us some sense of optimism, are 3 to 4 years out before they start contributing to the spawning biomass. And so we would expect through natural mortality alone that mature male biomass and preferred sized animals are likely to get worse. Again, some signs of recruitment, but time will tell, and we're a ways off before we see those. So I'm going to transition now to tanner crab. Again, here's just the spec table that came right out of the SAFE report. OFL of 72 million pounds, ABC of 54 million pounds. Stock status, at least according to this, looks pretty good. Looking at what these mean just in terms of numbers of animals, mature female biomass is down from 2020-21, but you know, sort of somewhere in the average-ish, low average-ish range looking back in the last couple decades. The state manages tanner crab in 2 management units, east and west of 166. So here's just a snapshot of mature male biomass broken up east and west, east to the left-hand panel there. You know, interestingly, we see different population trends between these two subpopulations, or the, you know, east and west of 166 anyway. So we saw, a survey saw an increase in numbers to the east and a decrease in numbers in the west. One of the more challenging aspects of barred-eye management in the Bering Sea is sort of a general lack of parsimony between what the survey sees and what the model sees. So looking at the bottom 2 panels here, the dots are the survey estimates, the line is the model estimates, and for reasons that we don't well understand, you'll see that the model always wants to find more crab than the survey does, and we oftentimes get sort of poor fit and poor convergence. And so, you know, one thing that we wring our hands about quite a bit is what is truth and measure of population do we generally use, but this terminal year uptick where we see generally much higher estimates from the model than we do in the survey is something that we grapple with every year. Here's survey size composition for male crab. Again, west on the left and east on the right. So on the bottom panel, you just see size from small to large as you move from left to right, and then years. Looking at the top, one interesting feature about tanner crab right now is we see a lot of small crab. You kind of see good positive signals of recruitment. You know, we like to see that in the population, but again, for reasons that I don't think we fully understand, although these are real crab, you know, we see them in the survey, they don't seem to propagate into larger crab. There's some bottleneck there where they'll hit this 60, 70 millimeter size, and then they just sort of disappear. We don't find them again. Every time you see one of these little peaks, the subsequent year, you'd expect it to move to the right as those crabs get bigger and march to the population. And we just don't see that for tanner crab. So even though it looks like there's sometimes good production, those crab are not reaching sort of a market size for tanner crab. So again, good signs of recruitment, but those strong juvenile cohorts are not propagating into larger sizes of crab and informing fisheries. A little bit unclear what is causing this population bottleneck. We didn't quite see the response. If our prevailing thoughts were this warming trend or warming period in the Bering Sea and the loss of sea ice was the sort of driving cause for population declines in snow crab, we didn't quite see that same signal in tanner crab, but we generally understand, and we've seen sort of this concept of borealization and the expectation we're going to continue to be in a warming trend in the Bering Sea. So whether or not some of that warming trend has influence on not seeing these larger crabs move into the population is to be yet discovered. So, you know, so bottlenecks for the tanner crab fishery seem to be there, but we don't quite know what those are quite yet. So finally here, I'm going to transition to Bristol Bay red king crab. Again, the specification table, you see ABC and OFL up a little bit from the previous couple of years. ABC is 5.35 million pounds. Stock status is up a little bit, but you know, somewhere between 50 and 100% for the last several years. So just cutting right to the chase, the state harvest strategy has a number of minimum size thresholds, and below that threshold, the fishery is closed. One of our thresholds is based on a female abundance, and when the population looks that there's less than 8.4 million mature female crab, this prompts a fishery closure in the state harvest strategy. You can kind of see that 2022, or 2021, we were well below that 8.4 million mark. Numbers of crab came up a little bit this year, but we are still below that threshold. We have to go back to 94, 95, and then to the mid-80s before we see similar numbers of mature female crab. A positive signal that we seem to have saw more crab this year, but still uncertain whether or not that's survey noise or if that's a true change in trajectory of the stock. But I think the bigger take-home here is we're really seeing a sort of progressive decline in abundance for quite some time now, really going back a decade. We're seeing sort of persistent and consistent decline in numbers of large animals. Same figure for mature males, a little bit of a different story here. We're seeing a bit of a turnaround here, and so we're now into our third year of slightly positive survey and assessment abundance. But again, I'll sort of note, if you look at the vertical axis here, it's, you know, still talking about low numbers, less than 10 million mature animals in the population overall. And you think about legal males, the males that are available to the fishery, I think we're right around 5.5 million legal males, and so still at, you know, really depressed states of overall numbers. And I'll note here that there's about half the number of mature males as there are mature females, and so not only are numbers down, there's a mismatch in sex ratio, and that gives us some concern about mating opportunity for females. This is really the takeaway for red king crab. Again, sort of looking at length frequency or size frequency histograms over time, not only are we not really seeing crab showing up in the smaller size classes, what crab that are there, except you can squint your eyes and look at topmost line, you know, they're getting older and they're getting bigger. And doesn't look like there's a supply of crab coming into the system anytime soon. So, you know, unlike snow crab where, you know, some indication that we have bottomed out and we expect something of a rebound, there's no signal of that for red king crab. There's just nothing in the system that suggests that, you know, we're going to see a rebound anytime soon. I think the general working assumption, at least within Fish and Game, is we'll likely level out, find some new equilibrium where we see adult or mature biomass sort of level out at 30 or 40% of long-term average, and we might just stay there. We'll have to think about what that means for future management. So, outlook for crab, positive. We're seeing some abundance increases for both mature males and mature females after a prolonged period of decline. Hopefully this is a trend, but population levels are still at critical low levels in our estimation. Low estimated recruitment. Again, females were below the harvest strategy threshold for the second year running. Length frequencies are discouraging, no signals of small crab, and you know, continued fluctuation of environmental conditions as that cold pool moves in and out of Bristol Bay likely has a strong impact on trajectory of the stock overall. I'll end here by just a quick snapshot of the other three stocks, St. Matthew, blue king crab, Pribilof Island red, and blue king crab. Sort of consistent and stable numbers of St. Matt's blue king crab. Still, again, weak signs of recruitment and expect to be in rebuilding status there for some amount of time. A positive signal in Pribilof Island red king crab, some increases in numbers there, but Pribilof Island blue king crab really at historical low, 4% stock status, and remains extremely depressed with little signal of recovery. Mr. Chair, that concludes my slides.
Thank you, Mr. Stickert. Is there any questions for Mr. Stickert? Kenny?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your presentation. I just got one quick question. I really appreciate this information sharing and the exchange and your great presentation here. When I'm looking at the state harvest strategy for snow crab, I'm just interested in the total mature biomass. What's special about the 83 to 97 average? I'm looking at, I don't think it'd make much difference, but I'm just curious what's special about that time period as opposed to 1980 to present, which is what we look at when we
Sure, good
look
question.
at crab. Thanks.
Mr. Down through the chair. So the 83 to 97 time period. So 83 as the start of the time period because it's generally a 6 or a 5-year 6 recruitment leg after the 1977 regime shift. So generally thought that regime shift in 77 sort of reorganized crab production and had a profound impact on crab productivity moving forward. So we wanted to sort of, 83 would have been the first generation of crab that would have sort of hatched under the new regime. So that's what informed the 83. 97 was just an artifact of this harvest strategy was adopted in 97, and at that time we used that as a basis for the time series because that was the terminal year at that time. And I apologize, I caught that in the version that you have, but in the version we have on the screen here, we have updated that to current, so 83 to 2021 as your long-term average, and that was a mistake that I set your PDF a little bit too quick before I caught that. So our assessment of stock status at 21% is the long-term time average from 83 to 2021. And it doesn't really matter whether you assess, if you use 83 to 97, we're at 19% of long-term average. So things actually get worse as you move through time. So it doesn't really matter what you define your time period at for the most part, whether or not it gets you above that threshold. I will note here, and I think this was a conversation among industry, that if you view the I think it's 88 or 89 regime shift as a new focal point of defining productivity moving forward and do a 6-year leg into the mid-90s, And so use a, let's say, a 95 to 2001 time series to use as your denominator in that calculation. You know, it puts you at 25.4%. So not a lot of biological or scientific evidence suggests that using a time series starting in the mid-90s is justifiable at this point. But acknowledge there's some variability there, that, you know, how you define what you measure yourself against matters, but in our assessment, you know, 0.4% over that measure is influential for a fishery, but we don't think that's reflective of productivity of the stock at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your answer. And I didn't catch that there was a difference between this and what was
Yeah,
presented
I
there.
apologize for that.
Appreciate you taking the time to run me through that because it was something I didn't totally understand. So I appreciate that information. Thank you.
Further questions?
Thank you. So I realize that most people in this room have been immersed in this for the last couple of weeks, and so bear with me. But a couple of things stood out to me. As I'm looking at the Bering Sea snow crab table, at first glance, it looks like the TAC percentage is quite a bit higher of the biomass than any of the other species that are presented. And amongst that table, this is slide 4, yeah, 2021 jumped off the page at me in terms of the TAC being set at 44.97 and 58.95 mature male biomass. Why was that done?
Right, so through the chair, Ms. Carlson Van Dorp, we had an awkward convergence of, you know, what we think is a unique set of environmental circumstances that led to a lot of natural mortality happening during a year when the 2020 survey was canceled because of COVID, and so we sort of missed that gap. I think, again, in retrospect, as I showed, that we understand now that we were seeing, you know, precipitous crash of the stock happening probably winter of 2018, certainly starting in 2019, likely bottoming out midpoint of 2020. But we missed that data point, and so we had to rely on model estimates. And without any critique on that process, truly some exceptional minds working on that, that's the information that we had. Survey trends and area swept survey information for crab management is critical. That really provides the floor for us to base our decision on. And then we review that against model outputs to try and find out where we think, you know, true population is. We didn't have that luxury for 2020, so we did rely on model estimates. The model was really wanting to believe that 2018 stock was still there and didn't want to find that crash, because we haven't seen that before. It was really unprecedented. And so we followed the model. That's all we had. That 45 million pound TAC was actually quite conservative relative to what the model was suggesting that the population was. I wish we'd have that back, but, you know, that was the best information and the best decision we could make at that time. And I feel, you know, historically the TAC, the state sets the TAC about usually between 40 and 50% of the ABC. They're usually pretty conservative relative to ABC. And I think we were right in that same category for 2020, 2021.
Follow-up? Thank you. So my note was on slide, I can't see it here. Anyways, the point being is that a couple of times you made reference, and you may have addressed it already and I just missed it, but you made reference, particular to snow crab, that these are natural mortality events of juvenile classes. What are you basing that assumption on?
We are missing those crab from the survey.
So you don't know if they're natural or not. There's some sort of mortality event, but we don't, I'm just wondering where you're getting that natural mortality event, or the causes of that mortality you're characterized as natural. I'm just wondering what you're basing that on.
Sure, through the chair, Ms. Cullerson Van Dorp. So the snow crab fishery targets 4-inch males. So they really target males that are around 100 millimeters in length. And so you would expect, you know, if you saw declines, you had a fishery and you saw a decline of 4-inch crab, there's going to be some natural mortality, there's going to be some fishery mortality. But because the fishery really does target 4-inch male crab, and when you see big declines, and particularly small female crab, and we saw some of the largest declines in small female crab, they're not interacting with the fishery. And so if you make the assumption those crab are dead, and the fishery's not interacting with them, then you assume it's all natural mortality. You know, could be movement, they have maybe moved outside of your survey grid, but again, that yet to bear out as a plausible answer here.
Go ahead.
Last question, and thank you for everybody's indulgence here. I was looking at 21, but I think it relates directly to the last question as well, as I was looking at, you know, you mentioned, I'm looking at the male tanner crab in west east, and you mentioned that again, sort of you're seeing this drop off in the population, and you're thinking that they're dying. I'm assuming that they're dying because they're not growing. So it's not that they're not just growing, they are dying. Is that what this graphic is telling me?
Through the chair, Ms. Carlson Van Dort, I mean, that's a reasonable assumption.
Okay.
You know, again, we have had fisheries for tanner crab. They've generally been small, and up until this year, they've been almost entirely in the western section, and so very little fishery or no fishery mortality, directed fishery mortality on those crab in the east. And so again, if you remove fishery mortality out of the equation, yes, there's always going to be bycatch in other fisheries. We understand that to be relatively low. But if you remove that from the population, all you left is natural mortality. And so unlike snow crab that have a much wider range and are much more sort of north and west distributed, where they might be walking on and off the shelf or in or out of the survey grid, you know, tanner crab are pretty centrally located, and we think we sampled them fairly well, and it's unlikely that movement is attributing to any of that. And so I don't think we're missing those crab. So what we're left is they're atrophying out of the population in some way.
And just for the record, you said that the bycatch is relatively low relative to what?
Well, I guess that's up to you, I suppose. And I don't have those numbers, so I guess relatively low relative to what the harvest strategy would allow for a directed fishery.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Further questions for Mr. Stickert? Seeing none, thank you, Mark. We're going to take a 5-minute break to resolve some technical issues, and we'll be back on the record in 5 minutes. Okay, we got our technical problem fixed up, and we're ready for our next presentation, and it'll be on, update on the snow crab rebuilding by North Pacific Fisheries Management Council. Are you folks ready to go?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Sarah Ryan-Smith, council staff. Good morning, members of the committee. I have myself and John McCracken, council staff, with me as well to just briefly walk you through the status update on the snow crab rebuilding plan. I want to first thank Mark Stickert for detailing the current stock status of EBS snow crab. I think he did a great job of explaining where we're at currently and the history of the stock leading up to the 2021 stock status shift into overfished, which prompted us to initiate the rebuilding plan per MSA guidelines. So the rebuilding plan, once a stock status is determined to be, or stock is determined to be overfished per the Magnuson-Stevens Act, Section 304, and the National Standard 1 guidelines, we are required, or the council must specify a time period for rebuilding the stock to target based on being as short as possible, taking into account the status and the biology of the stock, the needs of the fishing communities, the recommendations by internal organizations in which the U.S. participates, and interaction of the overfished stock within the marine ecosystem. Additionally, the MSA states that the time period should not exceed 10 years except where the biology of the stock, other environmental conditions, or management measures under an international agreement dictate otherwise. So we have just recently begun our rebuilding analysis document, and so I'll walk you through our timeline as it stands today. So in October of 2021, snow crab was declared overfished, and that was the date that we initiated our rebuilding analysis. And it is required by the MSA guidelines that we must institute a rebuilding plan within 2 years of this date. So October 2023 is when a rebuilding plan will need to be in place. In June of 2022, the council selected snow crab rebuilding alternatives for analysis. And over the summer, John and myself were working on preemptively analyzing these alternatives, and I'll walk through those in just a second. Most recently, at the October 2022 SSC meeting, the SSC recommended rebuilding parameters, and I'll detail those in later slides as well. Next up, at our December council meeting, there will be the initial review of the snow crab rebuilding plan, and the council will potentially select preliminary preferred alternative. Lastly, the February 2023 is tentatively scheduled to take up final action and review the final analysis of the rebuilding plan and select a preferred alternative to recommend to the Secretary of Commerce. So I want to walk through the alternatives that were selected by the council in June of 2022. The first alternative being no action. The second alternative being to adopt a rebuilding plan and specify a target rebuilding time not to exceed Tmax as recommended by the SSC. The stock will be considered, quote, rebuilt once it reaches BMSY. There are two options under this alternative. Option one, no directed fishing until the stock is rebuilt and allow bycatch removals only. And option two, allow bycatch removals and a directed snow crab fishery under the current state of Alaska harvest strategy. As I detailed at the June meeting, the SSC selected or recommended preferred rebuilding parameters. And this is just an excerpt from MSA guidelines stating that the shortest rebuilding time, T-min, is calculated based on the time frame to rebuild the stock to its MSY biomass or BMSY in the absence of no fishing mortality. If T-min is less than 10 years, then T-max is 10 years. And if T-min exceeds 10 years, then there are a few methods that you can use to determine T-max. So at the June 2022 meeting, the SSC recommended the approach for our projection in establishing a T-min of 6 years, resulting in 2029, and a T-max subsequently would be 10 years, so 2033. These are just the rebuilding projections and the timeline that was provided by the stock assessment author, Dr. Cody Zawalski. And when he was detailing the different rebuilding scenarios, he looked at 5 different projections, including one with no fishing, which is required by MSA guidelines to establish T-min, which resulted in the T-min of 6 years for 2029. He looked at a projection with ABC only, one with bycatch only, one with state and bycatch, and one with state minus bycatch. And as you can see here, the bycatch, state minus bycatch, and state plus bycatch, and the no fishing mortality resulted in the same rebuilding timeframe. And so that's the update that I have. As a reminder, John and myself will be bringing the initial review analysis to the council at the December 2022 meeting for full review, and we're working on compiling that as we speak. Thank you. I'll take any questions.
Yeah, thank you. Any questions for Ms. Ryan-Smith? Mr. Mesereau?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for your presentation. I was just hoping you could explain a little bit more those last statements you made regarding the impacts of no fishing or a bycatch only fishery. That it would look like, if you looked at that, that you could draw the conclusion that bycatch has no impact on the rebuilding of snow crab, but that's probably not the case. And I just wanted to give you a minute to explain that a little more clearly.
Thank you for the question through the chair. After speaking with the stock assessment author who detailed these projections, and I don't feel like I'm the most equipped to speak on the details of the projections, but as I understand it, it's just the scenarios that are inputted into the model that allow that. And I had spoke with him yesterday asking this similar question. And he had said that it's just the time frame of the OFL that he puts into the model to predict what it would be for the bycatch only and the state plus bycatch and state minus bycatch. And I apologize if that's a little bit vague. I myself don't quite understand the details of the projections entirely, and that might be a better question for Dr. Zawalski. Thank you.
Thank you. Further questions? Seeing none, thank you for your presentation. Up next, we have overview of Federal Pacific Cod Stock Assessment and Management.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Diana Stram, council staff. With me is Josh Keaton from NIMS Regional Office, and we'll be tag teaming this presentation. So we'll be providing you an overview of the Bering Sea, Aleutian Island, Gulf of Alaska cod assessment and management. Just to remind you, we manage 3 different stocks. The way the stock management works, there's a Bering Sea stock, an Aleutian Island stock, and a Gulf of Alaska stock. The way the cod is assessed in the Bering Sea, it was managed as a single stock from 1977 to 2013. Over a period of history, tagging studies showed migration between the EBS, the AI, and the GOA, and that still exists today. Eventually, research indicated discrete stocks between the Bering Sea and the Aleutian Islands, and there's a reference there to a bunch of different genetic and tagging studies. And in 2014 on, we set separate harvest specifications by area, but for reasons that we'll get into, the actual allocation and the setting of TAC is still aggregated between the BS and the AI because the sector allocations were all set up on a BSAI aspect, but for years and years prior to 2014, there was indications that they were separate stocks. So just to remind you, there's a sloping control rule to set harvest specifications. It provides for automatic rebuilding below 40% of the unfished level, which is how all of our groundfish stocks are set up at tier levels. There is also, because this is part of the stellar sea line rules for cod, pollock, and atka mackerel, there is a directed fishery closure at 20% of the unfished level, and that's for all of those stocks, but that includes cod. So Bering Sea cod, if you recall in recent years, when we've had the surveys in the northern Bering Sea, which we had in 2017, again in 2018-19, we missed the survey in 2020. There is a significant proportion since the original survey that I believe was in 2010 of the cod stocks in the Bering Sea. So that's been an issue in the cod assessment process in recent years. And beginning last year for the 2022 specifications, the cod stock assessment has included information from the northern Bering Sea in the stock assessment. So it's the one stock that currently we have that includes an ensemble model approach, which means that it includes an array of models, which also include survey information from the northern Bering Sea. And so it basically averages across those to come up with specifications. This just gives you the Pacific cod distribution. This includes the northern Bering Sea. You can see, obviously, we missed the survey in 2020, but you can see the relative concentration of the cod stock across the northern and eastern Bering Sea from 2018 through 2022. Just to give you the recent survey results, again, you can see the gap in 2020. On the left is the biomass in millions of metric tons. On the right is the abundance in billions of fish. Obviously, the trends differ slightly, but relatively trending the same. You see a slight uptick in 2022 from 2021, both in the biomass and the abundance. The abundance in billions of fish is fairly flat. When you incorporate the northern Bering Sea results, there's a slight downturn in 2022 from 2021. Again, we are, just for purposes of reference, we don't have the most recent assessment yet. We will have that in November. So this is all based on last year, but we do have the recent survey results. We'll have the most recent assessment in November. It'll be presented to the council in December. So this is based on last year. The 4 panels that you see to the left, top left, total catch, top right, total biomass, bottom left, spawning biomass, and bottom right, age 0 recruitment. Again, the spawning biomass is going down. Total biomass is also projected to go down. We see some recent upticks potentially in recruitment in the Bering Sea stock, but again, it has been on a general Bering Sea decline. Moving on to the Aleutian Islands, again, this stock is assessed separately in recent. Since it has been separated from the Bering Sea, it has always been assessed just based on survey biomass. That's the way our tier levels work for assessment purposes. We may see a different assessment in this cycle. There has been model-based assessments presented for Aleutian Islands for a number of years. They have yet to be accepted. This one shows more promise in that the teams and the SSC might accept the model-based assessment, but currently it is really pinned to the survey. And as you can see on the top right, the bottom trawl survey, we haven't had a survey in the Aleutian Islands since 2018. Due to COVID, it's on a biennial basis, and we lost 2020. So the 2022 survey biomass, you can see, is significantly down from the 2018 estimate. And then on the bottom left, you see the long line survey, also showing a general decline in the Aleutian Islands. Gulf of Alaska, as you know, there's been a significant drop in biomass. It's been the lowest survey estimate. This, I would note, the Gulf of Alaska survey, the AFSC survey in the Gulf of Alaska, is on a biennial basis, and we will not have another survey until next year. So the survey results that we're reporting are from 2021. And so those are still, the FSC longline survey, it shows a slight uptick. The bottom trawl survey shows a decline. As you know, the Gulf of Alaska cod assessment, biomass, and directed fishery have had a lot of declines in closures in recent years. This just shows you last year's assessment. Again, a continued decline in total biomass, continued decline with maybe some hope of recruitment in the spawning biomass and the age 0 recruitment for that. The total catch obviously is in decline because the directed fishery has been closed. Just to give you a little bit of a snapshot of some of the genetic studies in the Bering Sea and Gulf looking at population structure. So the This is all from a very, very recent presentation to the joint plan teams in September. They have not yet published this, but they've been developing a complete set of markers for classifying the differentiation between the Bering Sea and the Gulf spawning stocks with whole genome sequencing. So just to look at, in general, with the genomic sequencing for the samples that they have across the Eastern Gulf, the Western Gulf, the Aleutian Islands, the Bering Sea, and the Northern Bering Sea. So the most complete, the easiest break they have is genetic break 1, which you see, which is between the Eastern Gulf and the Western Gulf and Aleutian Islands. So that one's an easy, neutral genomic break between those two. Moving from there, the next most obvious break is basically from isolating Western Gulf and Aleutian Islands from the Northern Bering Sea. So that entire area, the Eastern Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands, through the Western Gulf. And then once they bring in what they call adaptive markers, so that's just a different genetic marker from the neutral genetic marker, so it brings in other characteristics in the genetic markers, they can isolate one more genetic break, which breaks off the Aleutian Islands, so the Western Gulf part and the Aleutian Islands, separating those into 3 separate populations. So basically, what they have right now in terms of the genetic populations in the Gulf are the Eastern Gulf and the Western Gulf, Northern Bering Sea and the Gulf Aleutian Islands, and then another one that's the Aleutian Islands and the Western Gulf. Looking at the Bering Sea itself, and we had some discussion of this at the planting meetings, it gets complicated. They're still working on the genetic breakouts within the Bering Sea itself. And there are tagging studies, I didn't include these in here, but there are tagging studies as well, more historical tagging studies, but that are showing some circulation between the Western Gulf and the Aleutian Islands and the southeastern Bering Sea. Okay, going into the COD specifications and allocations then. Mark Stickert already showed you this with respect to crab stock, so I won't go into it in terms of the difference between the overfishing limit and the acceptable biological catch. It's based on scientific uncertainty in your point estimate of the overfishing limit. How do we reduce the BSAI ABC prior to tax setting? Again, we set separate specifications for the Aleutian Island ABC and the Eastern Bering Sea cod ABC based on the stock assessments. From that, then, we reduce the ABC in the Aleutian Islands and the Eastern Bering Sea based on the state GHL, and this just gives you the numbers for 2022, which then leads us to what our federal TAC is. I would note that in 2023, the state GHL has increased, so 39% of the state GHL will be reduced from the ABC to set the federal TAC in 2023, and 12% reduction in the Eastern Bering Sea for the federal TAC in the Eastern Bering Sea. They are fully prosecuted fisheries. They're targeted by multiple gear types, primarily trawl gear and hook and line CPs. Smaller amounts by hook and line, jig vessels, and pot gear. You'll have a separate presentation on the small boat access from Dr. Hapala after Mr. Keaton and I are done here. Just to note, the council's modified the BSAI sector cod allocations for 30 years, and there have been 6 major modifications since 1994. So just to walk you through briefly, again, because the stock was not separated out as BS and AI until 2014, our allocations are still based on the aggregate BSAI TAC. So what happens is that we reduce it for the CDQ TAC in each area, and then we recombine the non-CDQ TACs for a BSAI combined non-CDQ TAC. From that, the sector allocations occur. So there's a Western Aleutian Islands limit in area 543 for a stellar sea lion provision. That comes off of the top. And then we allocate cod to sectors, hook and line and pot, trawl CV, AFA, trawl CP, Amendment 80, and then jig gear. From that then, the hook and line pot 60.8% is further allocated to under 60 hook and line and pot, hook and line CPs, hook and line CVs over 60 feet, pot CPs, and then the pot CVs that are over 60 feet. That then those allocations then get allocated by season. And so what happens is that at the end of the day, the aggregate non-CDQ TAC turns into 34 separate allocations that NIMS in-season management has to manage. From here, we'll move into catch by sector. Do you want me to advance your slides, or do you want me to try and move this over? Okay.
I'll reach over.
Okay.
Good morning. For the record, Josh Keaton with the Regional Office of Sustainable Fisheries, with NOAA. I'm going to give a brief overview of in-season management, the cod fishery. This here on this slide just gives you the total catch based on between 2021 and 2022 and the number of vessels. As you can see, we've had some increases in certain sectors and some decreases in certain sectors in both effort and catch. We'll go into that in a little bit more detail. So every year during the December council meeting, the in-season management group provides a very in-depth management report. So I'm just going to briefly go over the report from last year. We're currently doing the report for this year, and that will be presented at the December meeting. But I did not have those slides to present to you this morning, even though. So we do a mix of both spatial maps to show you where the location of the fishery is. What you have here is the Pacific cod by non-trawl catch, and if I can figure out the pointer. Well, never mind. So the area near Dutch Harbor is where your less than 60 pot cod fleet primarily operates. Any jig effort would do there. As you move over into 516, which is in the eastern part of this map, that is where the pot fishery, the pot greater than 60 fishery largely operates. And all the area in the more northern portion of the Bering Sea is primarily where the hook and line CPs and the pot CPs operate. Here we have the catch. It's split out by the various groups. You can see that hook and line CPs fish pretty much throughout the entire year. You can see the peaks of the A season and the B season, but when you get to the less than 60 hook and line and pot fishery, it really is limited to those first 4 weeks of the year, and then that season reopens in September, and it lasts for another 4 weeks. Same holds true with pot CV. I will note that the Bering Sea closed in 2021 to directed pot fishery in September. That differs from 2022, in which we closed the Bering Sea subportion of the Pacific cod on October 7th, so roughly 6 days ago. Moving on to trawl gear, this shows you where the effort of trawl gear happens. The darker bars obviously are for areas where more catch is taken, and that darker area near Dutch Harbor and Acatan is where the catcher vessel fleet primarily operates. The other areas are where the catcher processors operate. And likewise, we have the time series slide here, which shows when those fisheries operate. The catcher vessel trawl sector primarily fishes in the A season, and between January 20th and about mid-April, there is a B season allocation that starts on April 1. After that, there is very little effort overall in a directed cod fishery by the trawl fleet. We can move on to the Gulf of Alaska. Our Gulf of Alaska spatial maps are a little less, or they're more dispersed than the Bering Sea, and what you're seeing is the different areas, and they're geographically located to where popular fishing ports are. So in the Western Gulf, you have dark bars near areas of King Cove and Sandpoint, and when you get into Kodiak, you got the areas where these fisheries occur near Kodiak. For non-trawl gear, similar pattern, a little bit more spread out because due to the nature of the fishery, there's some use of tender vessels and others, and they just spread out. And then we have several slides here that show the time series. As Dr. Stram had mentioned, we have the allocation split between different regulatory areas. So you have the Western Gulf, and then I'll follow up with the Central Gulf. And I'll start with the Western Gulf here. This shows when the timing of the fishery happens by all those various sectors and where we came out on those allocations. Overall, we were about 70% of the quota last year, but these were a much lower amount of fishery than in in more prior years due to the decline in the cod fishery, or cod stocks in the Gulf of Alaska. These are a few informational slides that we provide to the council as well. This just shows you by a percentage breakout of what sectors are harvesting the cod, and you can see over time how they change. Trawl catcher vessels take the majority, or a larger proportion than other sectors in the Western Gulf, and that remains relatively flat and stable, but other sectors, they kind of spike and go all over the place, and that's just, when processing plants are open and when fisheries are open. We also provide a slide on the number of counts of vessels, just to show how effort is being impacted. You can note that 2020 was 0 because we did not have any open directed cod fisheries in 2020, but you can see that they kind of rebounded right back up when we opened those fisheries in 2021. Moving on to the Central Gulf, here's the time series slide for the Central Gulf, split by the various sectors, and how we go. Note that the trawl CP does have a large overage. We do track that, and we did prohibit retention of catch to limit any financial incentives to continue to harvest Pacific cod. Likewise, with the Western Gulf, we have the catch by sector. It's a little bit more stable than the Western Gulf. It's same sectors, and then likewise we have the counts of vessels, and with the 2020 being 0 and then popping right back up to more normal. Brief coverage, our brief slide on our observer coverage in the Bering Sea. The majority of the Pacific cod fleet in the Bering Sea is covered by 100% observer coverage. However, there are sectors such as the hook and line, pot, and trawl catcher vessel sectors, which are in the partial coverage sector, and I put the ranges of those goals, or what our rates, our selection rates are for those fisheries. There is an edit there. It is not 230%, it's 30%. I don't know how that slipped by. Apologies for that. And then finally, we have just an informational slide on the various GOA cod tax in the state GHL fisheries relative. And that would conclude my report.
Thank you. Any questions for Dr. Stram or Mr. Keaton? Ms. Carson Van Dort.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So going back to your introductory slide on Bering Sea cod, you noted that there was, beginning in 2022, an ensemble model approach being employed in assessment. And I'm just wondering what the advantage, well, first of all, does that carry over to the 2023 numbers? Or is that approach being used in what's currently being projected?
Sure, through the chair, thank you. It's been, so since we've gotten information from the Northern Bering Sea, which is in more recent years, there was a survey about 10 years prior, and then it hadn't been a surveyed effort, and part of warming in the Bering Sea has been increased effort in the Northern Bering Sea, and now a consistent survey in the Northern Bering Sea. Mm-hmm. And so for cod, that's been a real issue, and there's been a lot of trouble with the model aligning with survey estimates, particularly declines in the Eastern Bering Sea, and then seeing increases in the Northern Bering Sea, and that's sort of fueled a lot of the genetic studies as to, is that one population, are they separate populations? So all of that's been combined, and it kind of comes down to the assessment itself, and how do you resolve disparate information from the Northern Bering Sea and the Eastern Bering Sea and Southern Bering Sea. And so for a couple of years now, the assessment author has put forward some ensembles that have not been accepted until last year. And the purpose of the ensemble modeling is to resolve that there is disparate information but one population, and trying to average across a number of different model assumptions in order to come up with specifications that would include a variety of assumptions of where the population is and how best to assess it. So that I can't speak for the assessment modeler, but from being on the Bering Sea team, what was presented to us last month is that an ensemble model will also be produced in this cycle for setting specifications into 2023. So when we set specifications last year, we set them for 2022. We always set them for 2 years just to inform the proposed rule But the assessment cycle that will come forward to the council in December will be the updated results for 2023. And I would imagine that that would include an ensemble model structure as well.
Are there disadvantages to that model?
There's advantages and disadvantages to any model. I think the advantages to the ensemble modeling approach is that it encompasses a greater uncertainty in what we know about cod stocks and what we know about movement and what we know about population structure. As you're probably aware, ensemble modeling has been used for a number of years for the halibut population. And this is the first time, there's a large move nationally towards ensemble modeling to encompass uncertainty. And so this is the first time in the North Pacific that we have embraced an ensemble model for one of our stocks. And it's been a good way to capture what we don't know about the cod population in the Bering Sea and the Northern Bering Sea.
One follow-up, Mr. Chair. So, you know, one of the things that impressed me about your slide deck is all of these discrete allocations within the tax that are set by this model. And so I'm wondering if there is a degree of precision that is lost or a degree of precision that is gained in terms of how the managers will therefore, you know, manage the allocations within those 30 some odd groups that you spoke to earlier.
Through the chair, keeping in mind, so we have two discrete populations now, an Aleutian Islands population and an Eastern Bering Sea, Northern Bering Sea population. Those are assessed separately. They could trend separately, but the way our allocations are, you're automatically gonna lose a little bit of certainty because you then sum them together. And that's the way our allocations fall out. And until there's some change in how you would have to change Aleutian Islands allocations from Bering Sea allocations. That's not the way our sector allocations are set up right now. So just by nature of that alone, you are going to lose a little bit of certainty as it are.
Thank you.
Further questions? Seeing none, thank you for your presentation. And up next, we have council action on small boat access. Dr. Hapola.
Thank you. Through the chair, I'll just go ahead and introduce myself. As Mr. Jensen noted, my name is Kate Hapola, and I work on staff for the North Pacific Fishery Management Council. And today, the committee is going to be receiving a presentation on the Bering Sea, Aleutian Island, Pacific Cod Small Vessel Access Action. So just a brief summary and overview of the action that was under consideration for the council. So this is a proposed amendment to the Bering Sea, Aleutian Island, or the BSAI Groundfish Fishery Management Plan that would require smaller hook and line vessels and hook and line and pot vessels operating in the current under 60 sector to harvest Pacific cod from the jig sector's allocation. This slide provides the committee with a brief history and overview of the council's action on this issue. So in October 2019, the council initiated a discussion paper in response to public testimony from some stakeholders with smaller fixed gear vessels that were describing intersector competition, particularly from a subset of larger vessels with additional capacity, and the shortened seasons in response to decreasing BSAI Pacific cod tax over time that were creating some instability for those smaller vessels in the sector. And then in June 2021, the council received a presentation on that discussion paper and adopted a purpose and needs statement as well as a set of alternatives. Then in June 2022, the council received a presentation on the initial review draft of the analysis, modified its purpose and needs statement, and selected a preliminary preferred alternative. And then earlier this month at the October 2022 meeting, the council received a presentation on the final action draft and selected a preferred alternative. The council's purpose and needs statement that was adopted on June 10th, 2022 for this action is displayed here. And I'll just read it for the record. It's that increased participation, reduced Pacific cod tax, and fewer reallocations from other Pacific cod sectors have resulted in shortened seasons for the under 60 sector. Due to their size, smaller vessels in this sector are particularly affected by shortened seasons because vessel operators have less flexibility to fish when the weather is poor and typically fish in waters closer to port, which may be less productive. The jig sector allocation has not historically been fully utilized, particularly in the A and the C seasons, and allowing these smaller catcher vessels using hook and line and pot gear to harvest Pacific cod from the jig sector allocation may increase stability for current fishery participants and potential new entrants with smaller catcher vessels without negatively impacting those vessels that use jig gear. And the next two slides are just providing a brief overview of the two impacted federal sectors for this action. So first, the under 60 sector includes all catcher vessels that are less than 60 feet in length overall using hook and line and pot gear. This sector has had a 2% allocation of federal BSAI Pacific cod since 2008, and they received their full allocation on January 1 each year. There are 94 unique vessels that have participated in this sector since 2008, the majority of which, or 57 of them, have a registered LOA of exactly 58 feet. Vessels in this sector primarily participate in federal Pacific cod, state waters Pacific cod, IFQ, and salmon fisheries. And then I would just note that 76% of the vessels, or the vast majority that participate in this sector, have a registered ownership address in an Alaska community. And then the jig sector includes all catcher vessels or catcher processors that use jig gear. This sector has had a 1.4% allocation of federal Pacific cod since 2008. And unlike the under 60 sector, their allocation is apportioned on a trimester basis. So in the A season, which occurs from January 1 to April 30th, they receive a 60% apportionment. And then in the B and the C seasons that occur later in the year, their apportionment is 20% for each of those seasons. Since 2008, there have been 33 unique vessels that have participated in the sector, and the annual average level of participation has been 4 vessels. I would note, though, that in recent years there has been relatively low participation, so there were 0 vessels that participated in the jig sector in 2021, and my understanding is that there were no federal vessels in 2022 either. Vessels in the jig sector primarily participate in the federal Pacific cod and state waters Pacific cod fisheries, IFQ, and salmon, much like the under 60 sector, and 87% of the vessels that have participated have a registered ownership address in an Alaska community. This is a summary of the council's motion from October 2022. So at this last meeting, the council recommended the following as its preferred alternative. Alternative 2, the action alternative to redefine the current BSAI Pacific cod jig sector to include hook and line or pot vessels less than or equal to 55 feet in length overall, and that the B and the C season fishery would remain a jig-only fishery. After the jig sector's A season ends, all hook and line or pot CVs less than 60 feet in length would be in the same sector. This slide provides the committee a little bit more detail on how the council's preferred alternative would work. So the council's action redefines the Pacific cod jig sector during the A season, occurring from January 1 to April 30th, to include hook and line or pot vessels that are less than or equal to 55 feet in length. And that means that in the A season, the eligible gear types would be hook and line, jig, and pot. And then in the B and the C season, the eligible gear type would only be jig. All harvest from the redefined jig sector would be deducted from the jig sector's 1.4% allocation of federal Pacific cod. And then at the same time, the under 60 sector would be redefined during the A season so that only the harvest from hook and line or pot vessels with a reported LOA of 56 feet or greater, so those vessels that have a registered LOA of 56 to 59 feet, would be deducted from the current sector's 2% allocation of Pacific cod. And then after that A season ends, on April 30th, all hook and line or pot vessels under 60 feet in length would be in the same sector and eligible for reallocations of federal BSAI Pacific cod later in the year. And typically those reallocations to reopen the sector occur in the fall between September 1 and December 31st. Some points of consideration for the board and for the Board of Fisheries and why this committee is receiving the presentation. The council's preferred alternative would redefine the under 60 sector, and currently the state uses the under 60 sector's closure date as the trigger to open that Dutch Harbor Subdistrict or the DHS State Waters Pacific cod pot fishery. 7 days after the under 60 sector closes. And so the council's preferred alternative would be changing the definition of that sector in federal regulations, which means the board would need to consider addressing the trigger for opening that DHS pot fishery. Analytical staff presentations to the council in June and October 2022 did highlight that it's uncertain what future action the Board of Fisheries would take in order to open that DHS State Waters pot fishery. But we did note that the board could choose to use the new small vessel sector or the redefined jig sector's closing date, the redefined under 60 sector's closing date, or some other trigger such as a hard date in order to open that fishery. And we just wanted to highlight that the National Marine Fisheries Service rulemaking would take approximately 2 years for this action. And NMFS would look to have regulations implemented at the start of the calendar and fishing year, so likely at the start of 2025. And then lastly, we just wanted to highlight that the DHS State Waters pot fishery is a significant opportunity for pot vessels that are participating in the federal under 60 sector. So under current state regulations, each year that DHS pot fishery is set at 8% of the Bering Sea ABC with an annual 1% increase if 90% of the GHL is harvested until that GHL reaches 15% of the Bering Sea ABC. The 2022 GHL season for pot gear was set at 11% of the estimated Pacific cod ABC. And in 2023, the GHL for pot gear will be set at 12% because that sector and fishery did harvest 90% or over 90% of the GHL. And then something we just had highlighted in the presentation to the council, the last 2 bullets here on this slide are highlighting the federal vessel participation in the DHS State Waters pot fishery. So there have been 11 pot vessels that are less than or equal to 56 feet in length that have participated in the federal BSAI Pacific cod fishery, and 5 of those vessels have also participated in the State Waters pot fishery for the duration of the time, so 2014 to 2021, that fishery has been open. And I know that 56 feet is different from 55, and that's an artifact from our confidentiality rules. So the analysis had to look at revenue data for 56 and under because of the number of vessels with a registered LOA of 56 feet. For those 5 vessels that are the smaller pot vessels that have participated in both the federal and state DHS fishery, that has contributed approximately $1.51 million in annual average ex-vessel revenue. And then there are 42 pot vessels larger than 56 feet in length overall that have participated in the federal BSAI Pacific cod fishery, of which 38 have also participated in the DHS State Waters pot fishery. And for those 38 vessels, the State Waters pot fishery has contributed $7.27 million in annual average ex-vessel revenue. That concludes the staff presentation, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Havilah. Is there any questions? Angel?
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Kate. You went over this very quickly and efficiently. Thank you very much. I was just wondering if you could expand a little bit on some of the considerations the board may want to take into place with identifying an appropriate trigger date for the state water fishery. If you could just elaborate a little bit more on that, that would be helpful.
Sure, happy to do so. So thank you through the chair. I think the Board of Fisheries will, of course, receive proposals or ideas through their public comment process and from industry stakeholders. But those pot vessels that are, if the Board of Fisheries were to choose a trigger date from either of the new redefined sectors, pot vessels that do not operate in the sector that would be chosen as the trigger would likely experience some negative impact because we would expect the timing of the fishery to potentially change. So for the new redefined jig sector, part of the council's rationale for choosing this action and recommending that preferred alternative is that it would provide more stability to the smaller fixed gear vessels so they could extend their A season. Typically, the under 60 sector is wrapping up their season at the end of January, and it's just uncertain how long those smaller fixed gear vessels would take to harvest their allocation. So they could have a regulatory closure at the end of April, and in that scenario, if the Board of Fisheries was to choose the redefined jig sector to closures date to open the Dutch Harbor Subdistrict State Waters pot fishery, that would be a substantial change from how the fishery currently works. Conversely, if the Board of Fisheries was to choose the redefined under 60 sectors closure date, the timing of the fishery would probably look pretty similar to what you see now. But we would expect that the Board of Fisheries or the state would likely close parallel waters once the GHL opened for pot vessels under 58 feet in length. And that could mean that smaller pot vessels that are fishing in the federal fishery would need to choose to register to fish in state waters if they wanted to do so, or they could, wait until later in the year. So those were some of the impacts that we had covered in our staff presentation to the council earlier this month.
Further questions? Mr. Downs?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Hapla. My question, I got a couple questions, just I think that would be interesting in this information sharing with the Board of Fish. So on the confidentiality issue that forced you to look at a larger length, to look at 56 feet rather than 55 feet, which is on the is in the federal way of looking at confidentiality, is that 3 vessels or less? Is that where you drew the line? So in other words, we can, the board might assume that these 55-foot vessels that are fishing now, that will be, once this regulation's in place a few years from now, it'll be the 55-foot vessels that are fishing in the A season off of this jig allocation would be a few vessels, maybe 2 or 3. Is that the right assumption we can make from that?
Thank you for the question through the chair. Mr. Down, yeah, the confidentiality rule is 3 or less for those of us working in the council process. So just to be very clear, there are 5 vessels that have a registered LOA of exactly 56 feet in length that have participated from 2008 to 2021, and the average annual level of participation for vessels with that exact registered length is 2.4. And there are 28 unique hook and line or pot vessels that are less than or equal to 55 feet in length, but the average annual participation is 9 vessels. So it is a small amount for both of those size categories, but it was those vessels that have an exact LOA of 56 feet that posed the confidentiality issue for us in terms of revenue analysis.
Follow-up?
Thank you. A follow-up, a second question, actually, Mr. Chairman and.
No limits.
What's that? No limits. Okay, thank you. I've got a dozen or so questions then, but just one more question. So the jig allocation will remain the same for B and C season. There'll be nobody fishing off the jig allocation except for jig vessels, which have historically not fished, cut their allocation. That fish usually rolls over to other sectors, and you didn't touch on that point. I think it might be interesting to the Board of Fish for you to touch on what happens with this uncaught jig allocation in the federal fisheries, and based historically, who is likely to catch that fish?
Thank you for the question through the chair. Yes, so the jig vessels typically operate in the summer months or that B season fishery. That's just when it's safest for them to operate. So we see the vast majority of their historical landings in the federal fishery occurring between April and August. Any of the remaining allowance for the B season and then the C season in the fall, NMFS has historically reallocated to the under 60 sector, and that is based off of the reallocation hierarchy that NMFS has set in federal regulations. So the vast majority of the unharvested Pacific cod from the jig sector in the B and C season is reallocated to the under 60 sector on or near September 1st, and that reallocation has provided the reopening for a fall fishing opportunity for the under 60 sector.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr.
Further
Appel.
questions? Thank you, Dr. Appel. We're going to take our morning break, but I'd like to remind the public that sign up for public testimony is over after the next presentation. So get your blue card in if you want to testify. So we'll take a 15-minute break. Next, we have the overview of state-specific cod management and review of state-managed specific cod proposals. And Mr. Stickert's going to give the presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the record, again, my name is Mark Stickert. I work for the Department of Fish and Game, Commercial Fisheries Division in Kodiak. So as you see here, I'm going to walk us through sort of an overview, a summary of how the state manages specific cod fisheries, and then a quick walkthrough of proposals that may be of mutual interest between the council and the board. So again, really high elevation, and I apologize, quite a bit of this is going to be review and what we just saw from the federal summary, but clearly there are different jurisdictions. Federal groundfish management areas, there are 5. There are 3 in the Gulf, 1 in the Bering Sea, 1 in the Aleutian Islands. The state waters, obviously have fisheries that are prosecuted inside 3 miles, and we have 8 state groundfish management areas throughout the state. So this figure just shows you how these different management units overlap in space. The colored shaded areas are the federal management areas. So from right to left, you see the eastern Bering Sea, the eastern Gulf of Alaska, the central Gulf of Alaska around Kodiak, western Gulf of Alaska, Aleutian Islands, and Bering Sea. So again, those are the federal management areas. The state management areas are defined by named there and labeled, and then the state, and then the boundary lines. So you can see in some places, like Kodiak, for example, the state management area is fully found within the federal management area, but that's not always the case. In some cases, we've got state management areas that bisect or spread across multiple federal boundary areas, and it's required a little more consideration for those, but this just shows you how state and federal groundfish management areas overlap in space. So with that in mind, there are really 2 different types of state-managed cod fisheries. First one is what we call a parallel fishery. I think the easiest way to think about parallel fisheries is that portion of the federal, in this case let's call it cod fishery, that happens to occur inside state waters. For most intents and purposes, the state manages parallel fisheries by adopting most of the adjacent federal fishery regulations to not create a bright line, provide continuity for vessels that are fishing across that line. Any catch from a parallel fishery gets accrued to the federal TAC, but the state does have jurisdiction and can preempt federal regulations or insert their own regulations with respect to how parallel fisheries are managed. The second type of fishery are GHL, or state waters fisheries. These are fully independent from a day-to-day management point of view anyway from federal and parallel fisheries. Again, these occur inside 3 miles, and they are exclusively guided by the board process. And as you've heard, and we'll discuss again here in a few seconds, the harvest is deducted from a separate state GHL. So I'll move through this fairly quickly. Again, for the intersection between sort of federal and state cod management really happens at the ABC level. I think we're all pretty familiar with the assessment process. There's surveys, fishery data research, they get fed into models, a fair amount of review. Ultimately, the council adopts these model recommendations, and from those result an ABC. That ABC then gets divided as TAC to the federal fisheries and as GHL to the state fisheries. And so, GHL plus TAC must equal ABC, and so this is really where the majority of interaction between state and federal management occurs. We saw this from Dr. Stram. Just again, ABC is the total number of cod that can be removed in a given year across all sources. TAC informs federal fisheries, GHL informs state fisheries. Here's just another sort of snapshot on sort of the interaction between GHL and TAC. So just looking at the Bering Sea ABC up here, as we heard, the state takes a proportion of that full ABC. In this case, it slides between 8 and 15%. As we saw, the 2022 GHL was 11%. It gets allocated as GHL off the top of the ABC, and then the state fishery is structurally quite simple compared to the federal fisheries. That a full 11% goes to the pot fishery, and then there's a small sort of subsequent jig fishery that also occurs, and that has a fixed 100,000 pound GHL there. So again, as we saw, the remainder, in this case 89% in 2022 ABC, gets allocated as TAC. a little over 10, or a little under 10% comes off of that, or 11% as CDQ. The remainder, 89 of that 89%, gets spread across, in this case, 9 or 10 different sectors at varying allocations, and then each of those sectors then have further allocations of their sector's allocation across seasons. So a lot of moving parts, and I think this is really the crux of state and federal overlap is when one system changes, there's a big cascading effect to the other system, and I'd be really thoughtful about how that happens. I'd say similar to the federal fisheries, even though structurally smaller and less complex, the state fisheries tend to be fully allocated. So with that in mind, just a few descriptors of features of what these parallel and state waters fisheries look like. Again, parallel fisheries occur inside 3 miles. They open concurrent to the federal adjacent fishery by state emergency order. There's a shared TAC. For most intents and purposes, the state adopts all the same gear sectors and gear types. However, the state Board of Fish, in a number of circumstances, has chosen to put side limits or exclude certain gear types in its entirety inside 3 miles. Similar to the federal fisheries, there's no gear limits. One defining feature is the state of Alaska has their own limited entry program, and so we do not recognize the federal permitting, FFP and LLP, and so technically parallel groundfish fisheries, while operating off the TAC, are open access fisheries. There is no requirement for a federal permitting. The state adopts most stellar sea line protection measures. Stellar sea lines has been a major contributor to management changes over time, and then any federally permitted vessel then falls under the federal observer program. In contrast, sort of same logic here, looking at state waters fisheries. Again, same jurisdiction. Harvest limits are based on the GHL, which is a direct deduction from the ABC. Most state waters cod fisheries are designed to be coordinated with federal seasons. So, and we'll talk about this some more, and as you heard, the under 60 federal pot cod sector typically closes in late January. The state waters sub-district pot cod fishery opens up 1 week after the federal fishery closes. Oftentimes, there are very closely aligned fleets, for the most part. Boats that fish in the federal fishery also then fish in the equivalent state fishery, and so they're lined up so that way we do not have overlapping or concurrent federal and state fisheries happening in the waters at the same time. For the most part, most state waters fisheries are limited to pot and jig gear. There are a few exceptions to that. All state waters cod fisheries are open access. There are no limited fisheries. However, each area does have exclusivity regulations, and basically what that does is forces boats to choose an area, and it limits a boat's ability to move across areas in a given year. The state follows some sea line protection measures. Basically, we acknowledge 3 mile no transit zones, but the remainder of the protection measures don't apply to the state fisheries, and currently the state does not have a groundfish observer program. So with that in mind, there are 11 proposals related to this board cycle coming up here in a couple weeks. I would say all but 4 of those may have some mutual interest to the council and the board, and I'll step through those proposals now. The call for, I'll note here, the call for this meeting really is for Chignik, the Alaska Peninsula, Bering Sea, and Aleutian Islands. So it's really the equivalent of the Western Gulf, Aleutian Islands, and the Bering Sea federal areas. So a number of proposals are focused on the Aleutian Islands sub-district state waters cod fishery. Just to give you a little bit of background on this fishery, I would say the overarching objective of this fishery is to promote opportunity for predominantly less than 60-foot small boats that deliver to local shore-based processors. And this fishery is really designed to try and put fish into a shore plant in ADAC. Understanding Aleutians and ADAC is a tough place to operate, both from a fishing and processing sector. Oftentimes, this objective cannot be met, so there's a secondary objective of this harvest strategy that acknowledges sort of historical fishery participants, predominantly federal fishery participants, to enter the fishery and try and catch that GHL so we don't strand any ABC. This fishery was developed and first implemented in 2006. I think as we saw, the GHL can be up to 39% of the federal ABC for the Aleutian Islands subarea. It's structured such that the GHL will increase 4% each year, up to a maximum of 39% if the previous year's GHL is caught. There's also a step-down feature here. If the GHL is not caught 2 subsequent years in a row, then it steps down all the way down to a minimum of 15%. There's also a full cap. There's a 15 million pound cap. So it's based on the GHL or 15 million pounds, whichever is lower. So the fishery can never exceed a 15 million pound GHL. The Aleutians fishery is unique in that all other state cod fisheries then further allocates the GHL to each individual gear type, as we've seen in lots of examples. This fishery does not do that, and instead has a fairly complicated matrix of time and area triggers and openings that are meant to sort of provide opportunity to different sectors at different times of the year. As I mentioned, it's an open access fishery, and this is the only fishery that has trawl gear as legal gear type, so pot, trawl, jig, and longline. Pot and trawl gear are the dominant gear types. And because there's obviously a large difference in the fishing efficiency between those types of gear types, there's a 150,000 pound daily and trip limit. So no boat, regardless of what you look like, can have more than 150,000 pounds on board any given time. So it meant to sort of equalize opportunity across different sectors. So here's just a map of this area, and I said there's sort of a couple different time and areas. I'll note here the ADAC section. So really we have a fishery within a fishery for the Aleutians. I'll just put that up there to reference. And this is what managers use as a basis to guide fishery opens. So again, so on the left-hand columns, you've got the ADAC section, which is really waters that surround ADAC, and then there's all of the Aleutian Islands. As I mentioned, the primary objective here is to provide small boat opportunity. So on January 1, within the ADAC section, under 60-foot boats, whether you're pot, jig, longline, or trawl, all enter the fishery. And the idea is those boats are most likely going to be delivering to a shoreside processor in ADAC. And then as the season progresses, the fishery essentially ratchets open. And so after a certain amount of time, usually based on a closure of a different federal fishery, the entirety of all state waters opens within the AIS. And then first, it's usually pot boats between 60 and 100 feet enter the fishery. And then as it stands right now, on March 15th, trawl vessels under 100 feet and pot vessels greater than 100 feet can enter the fishery. So a fairly complicated matrix of triggered openings here, again, designed to sort of fulfill the objectives of what the fishery is designed to do. So with that in mind, there's a proposal that seeks to essentially eliminate all of this. It wants to get rid of this big matrix, and it wants to revert the AIS basically back to the footprint of what most other state waters fishery looks like. It wants to make it a 58-foot pot gear fishery, pot and jig gear fishery. So that's what this proposal would do. It would allow pot boats up to 100 feet. It would put a pot limit of 120 pots in, and it would restrict larger size pot vessels from harvesting more than 25% of the total GHL. Just to give you a sense on who fishes in this fishery over time, here's just a stacked bars that shows the proportion of total harvest by gear type over time. As you can see in the left-hand side, the darker gray bars that most catch was occurring by trawl vessels. They slowly decreased over time. Then the lighter gray bars are, it's a little bit of longline and jig effort for the first 4 or 5 years of the fishery. That essentially, we haven't had jig or longline effort since 2013 predominantly. And then there's been, generally a shift towards pot harvest being the primary harvester in the area. There's a few exceptions. 2015 and 2016, all catch was caught by trawl boats. 2017, all catch was caught by pot boats, and then sort of a mix after that. So a lot of moving parts onto why we see this diversity, but this is just a snapshot on who's been fishing in the fishery historically. So proposals 3 and 4 both address the harvest strategy management plan directly. As I mentioned, trawl vessels at this point are restricted from entering the fishery prior to March 15th. A couple trawlers would like to amend the management plan and open the fishery on March 1st for trawl vessels over 60 feet, just give them a little more opportunity. This just sort of shows you when those boats have historically fished in the last number of years, ranging between late February and mid-March. So we're going to transition here now away from the Aleutian Islands to the Dutch Harbor Subdistrict State Waters Fishery. Just a little bit of context. This fishery was the newest state waters fishery to be created. It was implemented by the board starting in 2014. We've heard a lot about the GHL. It's on a sliding scale. 2023 will be 12% of the Bering Sea sub-area ABC, open access. As we heard, this fishery is structured to open up and be coordinated with the equivalent federal sector. So when the federal under 60 hook and line and pot A season closes, the state waters fishery opens up 7 days after that. That 7 days between fisheries allows boats to deliver their federal gear. The state fishery has a 60 pot limit, and so federal fisheries do not, and so usually those boats need to take care of their extra gear, get into town, get tags, and get registered, and they open up shortly after. And then to mention there's a sort of in line with some of this small boat access concept, there's a small jig fishery that was created in 2019. So here's just a snapshot of effort, catch, and value over time. I'll note that the GHL has sort of varied based on policy changes. This year's GHL was 37 million pounds. The fishery is currently open. We expect it to be fully harvested here within the next couple weeks. But on average in recent years, between 30 and 40 boats fish in the fishery, and then at least based on reported ex-vessel price, the fishery ranges between 10 and $16 million in recent years. So proposal 5 would, I think we can consider this a parallel sort of companion proposal to the small boat action that we just heard about under the same logic. This proposal would limit pot vessels from fishing in and around Unalaska Bay to vessels that are no greater than 55 feet in length during the Dutch Harbor Subdistrict Fishery. Kind of hard to see there, but the hashed areas are the couple stat areas, state stat areas that correspond with the area defined in the proposal. Similar to what you heard before the break, not a lot of 55-foot boats fishing in the Dutch Harbor Subdistrict Fishery now. Since 2014, there's been at least one boat that is less than 55 feet that have participated in the fishery, so the downstream effects or downstream benefits of the proposal are a little bit unknown or maybe muted. Proposal 6 is the proposal that will most likely generate the most amount of attention. It seeks to restructure how the Dutch Harbor Subdistrict GHL is computed on an annual basis. And specifically, it seeks to implement an ABC abundance-based tier approach to set the GHL. As we heard, right now it floats between 8 and 15%, where the trigger to get more quota is achieving the previous year's GHL. This one would essentially set the exploitation range between, or the allocation range between 10 and 13%, and establish a cap of 44 million pounds or 20,000 metric tons. And basically where you fall in that allocation range depends on really the biomass of the stock. And so when the stock is low, the state waters fishery essentially receives a lower allocation of the total ABC. When the stock is high, you get more up to a cap. The box below, as I noted, there's currently a stair step now where if you achieve the GHL, you go up. This one seeks to sort of repeal that and implement its own sort of, we call GHL allocation modifiers, and it basically inverses it. It suggests that simply achieving the GHL shouldn't get you more quota the next year, but should you not be able to realize your quota, your GHL in a given year, this proposal would allow that to step down, again, down to a minimum of 10%. So this table just shows you what this proposal would have looked like had it been in place. So on the left-hand sort of couple columns there, you see the ABC in pounds and tons. See there's a fair bit of variability. We've gone from a relatively high ABCs down to a decline in some relatively low ones, 273,000 pounds in 2021. In the middle set of columns there, you see the current basis for the GHL. Again, we're at 11%, translates in about 37 million pounds. And had this proposal been in place when the fishery was established, you would see sort of where the computed GHLs would have been. And for the most part, you would see, I think not for the most part, in every situation here, there would have been a net increase in total cod available to the Dutch Harbor subdistrict fleet because the GHL would have been based on predominantly 13%. Net increase looking backwards, looking forward, once the state really achieves its 13%, there would be no added increase. And so in situations where the state would take 14 and 15%, this proposal would actually then probably limit the amount of cod that would be available to them under the old rules. So moving away from Dutch Harbor Subdistrict now, there's one sort of regional jig proposal that is seeking to get some conversation from the board. And what it would do is establish black rockfish and Pacific cod jig fisheries as non-exclusive and open all state waters cod fisheries on January 1. So on the top table in the right-hand box, you can see there's 5 different jig fisheries, and these numbers are a 10-year average of effort and catch. As you can see, jig fisheries oftentimes struggle to catch their full GHL allocation. So in this case, less than 30% of the long-term average GHL is harvested by these jig boats. I think this is in part due to the box below, that I think one of the main thrusts or strengths of state waters fisheries is they're really designed to reflect the preferences of the fleets that fish in them. And so you kind of see that in each of those 5 different areas, the rules are different. And that is because the fleets like to have a fishery that looks like themselves. In effect, what that does is you kind of reduce the ability for a jig vessel to move around and move from Kodiak to the peninsula or move from Dutch Harbor to Kodiak. It sort of restricts movement. If a fishery was fully allocated, I would say it's a good idea, right? It provides stability to the fleets. In this case, I think the argument is these fisheries are not fully allocated. They're not realizing their full catch, and providing some flexibility for allowing jig boats to move around may promote some opportunity. Right now, with the low cod abundance and relatively low availability of cod in the Gulf, there's a small core jig fleet. Now they're suggesting that if they had more flexibility to move around and start fishing earlier in the year, they would more likely achieve their GHL. Finally here, we're going to switch away from cod just a little bit. The state of Alaska also prosecutes our own state waters sablefish fisheries. State water sablefish fisheries began in 1995 in response to the federal sablefish fisheries moving to an IFQ system. As I mentioned before, the state does not recognize federal permitting inside state waters, and so the state identified that we couldn't discriminate against IFQ holders, and so in response, when those fisheries became rationalized, the state closed all state waters to sablefish fishing to all participants, except in areas that there was historic catch of fish inside state waters. And so in those areas, I believe there's 4 or 5 of them, the state opted to open up their own independent state-managed sablefish fisheries. It's very similar to the structure of the Pacific cod fisheries. So focusing on the Aleutian Island sablefish fishery, again, opened up in 1995. The GHL for the state waters fishery at that time was sort of take a tier 5 approach, was we took the average historical harvest inside state waters from the federal fishery and allocated that as a basis for the new GHL in the state managed fishery. Shortly after it was established, through 2002, the fishery was fully allocated. Then we went through a period where we weren't catching the full GHL until this last year. 2022 was the first year in 20 years here that we caught the GHL. Most of the other regulations of the state waters fishery follow the federal regulations, pot, jig, longline, hand trawl gear, all legal gear types. The season is open concurrent with the federal IFQ. Federal participants can fish in the state waters fishery. They can move that line, but they have to register for the state waters fishery when it's open. And so this is sort of the basis for the fishery. Similar to what we see for Pacific cod, TAC plus GHL, it all comes off the ABC. In this case, this proposal seeks to actually establish 5% as the allocation removal from the ABC. One of the tricky parts to this fishery is the state-defined management area crosses both the Bering Sea, the Aleutian Islands, and the Western Gulf. And so we're proposing to take a 5% allocation off of the combined Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands ABC. And then there'll be a coincidental reduction in the ABC, or in the tax for the federal fisheries. Right, so, this year in particular, we're seeing, the last couple of years, we're seeing an increase in biomass and sablefish. Prices have been strong, availability of sablefish to traditionally smaller boat participants is high. So I think this is becoming important because both the federal TAC and the state GHL are all being harvested. And so we're bumping up against harvesting the full ABC. And so it's much easier if we're going to stay in a trend where the ABC is going to be caught in this area, which oftentimes it is not. It's much easier for specification time to understand how much TAC there is and how much GHL there is, so both the state and the federal governments can manage those numbers and ensure the ABC doesn't get fully harvested, or exceeded, excuse me. And that concludes my summary. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Is there questions for Mr. Tickert? Olson Dundort.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So that last slide that you were just looking at, or that you were just presenting on, I'm sorry, one more. This one. First of all, this is a really helpful and very informative presentation, and I wanted to thank you for it. And so that 5% that's being proposed, GHL, coming out of the total BSAI ABC, how would that be deducted from the Bering Sea and the Aleutian Island ABCs respectively? Like 2.5% each, or has that been sorted out? And maybe this is a discussion at the board level.
Defer to the federal counterpart here. I think I know the answer, but someone else.
Thanks.
Thank you, through the chair. So we just did this in proposed specifications in advance of doing this for real in December. As Mark said, it comes off the total, we deduct it from the Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands ABC, but then the 5% we actually take out of the Bering Sea sub-area because that's where it's being fished.
Got it, thank you.
Further questions, Angel?
Thank you, Mark. This was a lot earlier on in your presentation, and I agree, this has been very helpful and informative. You mentioned that boats participating in the parallel fisheries still needed to abide by observer coverage regulations, and wondering if that data is split up, the PSC interactions are split up between the federal and state water participation for those vessels that are in the parallel waters. Does that make sense?
Yeah, through the chair. So as a condition of an FFP, if you have an FFP on board and you're fishing in a parallel fishery, you fall under the Federal Observer Program requirements. I think as you saw in the earlier summary from Mr. Keaton, that observer rates typically, especially for under 60 size pot vessels, tend to be spotty. And so while I think my guess is yes, you could probably isolate out observer data specifically from the parallel fishery, from federally observed boats, but that data is going to be sparse, and I think interpreting that would be challenging. And it's not like these boats are fishing just inside 3 miles and just outside 3 miles. They're likely transversing this line because the point of a parallel fishery is to eliminate the line so fishermen don't have to be sort of making decisions on that. And so it's there. We have looked at it more specifically in the Gulf. It's difficult to scale, but an avenue to explore if you want.
Further questions? Mr. Down.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I just wanted to ask a question about your Bering Sea cod allocation slide that was way earlier in the presentation, but I just wanted to make a point here. I see Mr. Keaton's here. Maybe he can clarify this for us, but the way that you've got this drawn out for the Aleutian Islands, and I'm only asking this because you've got the Aleutian Island proposals in, and as well as Bering Sea cod proposals. On on the portion that indicates that 89.3% of the Aleutian Island TAC goes to the non-CDQ sectors, it flows that then it goes to all of these various allocations. But I don't believe that we have individual allocations in the Aleutian Islands. In other words, one sector could take all of that fish. It doesn't, it's not the same as the Bering Sea as you've got it drawn out here. So I just wanted to make that, get a clarification on that, maybe just so people know. I don't think this is quite correct.
Mr. Down, through the chair, I agree. It's one of the oversimplification. I think my intent here was really to show the sort of diversity of users and the amount of times an ABC gets split. Yes, in this case, and I think we just saw, you know, the Bering Sea cod ABC was reached and we just closed the fishery. Those vessels that also then could shift and fish the rest of their allocation in the Aleutian Islands, should they choose to do that.
And they could choose to do that without limitation to these particular numbers. Thank you.
Further questions? Seeing none, thank you for your presentation. And what we have up next is public testimony. If you haven't put your blue card in, it's too late now. So, well, we're going to start with public testimony, and the first up I have on the list is Jamie Goen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the Joint Protocol Committee. I'm Jamie Goen with Alaska Bering Sea Crabbers. We represent the harvesters of king, snow, and bear-dye crab in the Bering Sea. There's roughly 60 vessels in our fleet. It's devastating what is happening to Alaska's iconic crab stocks in the Bering Sea. Snow crab is closed for the first time in the history of U.S. management of this fishery, and red king crab for the second year. These closures are costing the fleet $500 million in losses. Second and third generation crab fishermen are facing bankruptcy and losing their way of life. Deckhands are out of work. I met one a couple of weeks ago that's been on the boat for 25 years, and he's out of a job now. When you look at the effect on fishing communities like Dutch Harbor, St. Paul, King Cove, and Kodiak, and their schools, and the effects on support businesses like shipyards, welders, gear manufacturers, and fuel docks, that number grows to the billions of dollars. That's billions. The bear-dye fishery this year is enough for 2 to 3 vessels out of our 60-vessel fleet. Many of these boats will tie up, some will go bankrupt, and this may trickle down and limit the number of salmon tender vessels that are available next summer. The impacts on Alaska and Alaska's communities are staggering. You, as the Joint Protocol Committee, have an important role in finding solutions between the federal and state management of crab fisheries. The Council's science body last week flagged several issues that could be addressed. It's on page 1 of their minutes under C1, under that agenda item. ADF&G state managers are working hard to figure out what happened and have ideas on improvements to management. For example, how do we get to a meaningful OFL and ABC? We rarely approach the ABC for crab, and the state rarely uses the OFL and ABC outputs in TAC setting. TAC is generally about 40% of the ABC, and yet snow crab is overfished. That just doesn't add up. If mortality is below ABC, how are these populations declining to levels closing fisheries? And how do we get to a meaningful OFL and ABC that is used by the directed fishery as well? Do we have the right biological reference points for crab, seeing as stocks around the state are struggling? Why aren't we taking fishing pressure from other sectors off of molting and mating crab while they're in this vulnerable soft-shell state like is done in other countries that have maintained healthy stocks during climate change? Why aren't we protecting key areas of crab and habitat? Why aren't we protecting recruitment? If these stocks are at such a level of conservation concern that directed crab fisheries are closed, then the Council should have taken immediate and emergency action at last week's meeting to implement further measures to protect red king crab and snow crab. For snow crab, the Council should be protecting the small signal of recruitment and making sure that there are enough males and females so that clutch sizes can be full again. That means taking fishing impacts from directed and non-directed fisheries off of these stocks, and they didn't. This wasn't new news for red king crab. The Council saw this coming for over a decade and still hasn't acted. Better management is doable for all Bering Sea fisheries by moving them in time and space. There is a way to keep all sectors fishing and bring back crab stocks, but it is going to take leadership at the council level and collaboration between federal and state managers and scientists and bodies like this one. In closing, I ask you to prioritize finding solutions within your power for a better path forward for Bering Sea crab stocks and the fishermen and communities that rely on them. For example, would the state's stock of concern approach make sense for crab? I know it's used for salmon. Would that make sense for crab? What's the Joint Protocols Committee's responsibility for bridging the disconnect in the federal and state management of the fishery? The Board of Fisheries has guiding principles for crab management. If those aren't being met, what's your plan of action for how is that going to trigger action between the council and Board of Fish? And with that, I'll happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Goen. Questions for Ms. Goen? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony. And up next we have George Pappas.
Thank you, Chairs. George Pappas, Office of Subsistence Management, State Subsistence Liaison. I'm seated on the Board of Fish and Board of Game as a Federal Subsistence Advisor. Been in the process for quite some time. It's good to be here instead of being a 12-foot head on the wall. It's great to see a lot of faces I've seen around since the 1900s. And my purpose here is just to provide a little bit of background information to why you keep receiving letters from the Federal Subsistence Management Program about their concerns. For salmon bycatch, of course, you've heard from a lot of our regional advisory councils over time. And also for crab, you've heard concerns about Norton Sound out of our Seward Peninsula area. And the reason you're hearing from us, even though we have very little overlapping jurisdiction, actually very little, is the Federal Subsistence Board established the regional advisory councils as a place for subsistence users to voice their concerns. So at our meetings, we do hear a lot of concerns about, say, sea otters and halibut and migratory birds and bycatch in the Bering Sea. But that's not within our federal subsistence jurisdiction. But I just want to make sure you're aware that you'll probably see increase in frequency of correspondence from the program commensurate with the restrictions and conservation concerns that federally qualified users are running into across the state for different species. I don't have any new information here for you. That's new information possibly for both sides. You'll probably see us see a few more letters from our program. Ops Subsistence Management is required to help with the process when we requested to express the subsistence users' concerns. So you'll see letters from us from time to time. That's all I have, and it's really good to see everybody in person.
Thank you, George. Questions for George? Ms. Carlson, then Norton.
No question, but I really appreciate the communication from the Federal Subsistence Board and the incorporation of some of their concerns and information at that level. Thank you.
One other piece of information, we do have OSM is housed in Fish and Wildlife Service, even though I represent 5 federal agencies at the boards. We do have Aaron Martin, who sits on the council as a federal representative to provide information. And most of the information from the B report about subsistence we provide. It's just to continue every year the same. For the B report, likely you'll see something from OSM will be a list of all the restrictions statewide, so you understand that there are conservation concerns in different parts of the state, and AYK is fairly, well, everybody knows the situation here, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, George. Up next, we got John Moeller.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. For the record, my name is John Moeller. I'm originally from Unalaska, currently live in Juneau. In fact, I'm probably the last person born in Unalaska on purpose. My comments today, I wasn't going to testify, but I wanted to take this opportunity to just make sure that the Board of Fish members on this committee have the benefit of some of the conversations I've had with you council members over the last week here relative to ADAC. By way of history here, I'm an active commercial fisherman. I'm a former Bering Sea crab fisherman. As I mentioned, I grew up in Unalaska. I'm actually the former manager of the fish plant in ADAC. In 2008, I managed the plant, or it managed me, as the case may be. I have a company that, one of my clients is ADAC Community Development Corporation. For those of you that are not familiar with that, it's a CQE. And we refer to it as AC/DC for those of you that were into the rock band stuff in the 80s. AC/DC actually is capped out on his halibut IFQ. It's capped out on his black cod IFQ. In other words, we purchased IFQ for the benefit of ADAC. And there's a 10% golden king crab, Aleutian Islands golden king crab allocation, all meant for the benefit of ADAC. So you can see I'm working for a corporation now that actually has a real interest in making sure that there's a fish plant happening in ADAC. And I wanted to take this opportunity, I'm not going to speak anything specific to the proposals in front of the board later this month. I'll wait for that time. But I wanted to give the board members here, the Board of Fish members here, the benefit, as I mentioned in my original comment here, the benefit of what's going on in ADAC. Some of the presentations here referenced, you know, the struggles, if you will, and the hurdles relative to a fish plant in ADAC. And I think everybody knows in this room the colorful story that is painted relative to fish plants that have struggled. I was part of managing one of those at one point in time. But again, I wanted to take this opportunity to tell you the positive side of ADAC. One of the primary reasons they hired me was because of my experiences out there, both harvesting as well as processing in the Aleutians. And AC/DC hired me to help them to take it to the next step in terms of finding an operator that's going to be able to operate out there. So I wanted you that weren't aware of this to hear from me that there's some real positive progress here, and the real hope here is to have a fish operator processing fish here by this time next year. We know how all of that goes, and we understand that the difficulties of operating in the Aleutians, but that's our hope at this point, and I just wanted to take this opportunity to inform you on that. So, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the time.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Moeller. Questions for Mr. Moeller? Thank you for your testimony. Okay, with that, we're on to our fifth agenda item, and the committee discussion of the agenda items. Anybody have anything to talk about on the agenda items we just heard?
Mr. Chair, thanks. I guess I'm not too familiar with this part of the agenda, so please let me know if I'm out of turn here. But I did want to actually punt to Mr. Witherall, and I think it might be helpful for the board to hear more details about the action the council took on agenda item D2, specifically the emergency rule request and next steps in the work plan, if you wouldn't mind. Sorry for catching you off guard.
I'm going to look for my notes, wherever they are. No one brought them. Anyway, I can do it from memory. Under D2, that was the red king crab discussion, and there was a motion that passed that would identify that stock, along with snow crab, to be a primary conservation concern of the council. And what that does is it triggers a few things. First, that the council is going to review the analysis of the emergency rule that would prohibit all other gear types essentially from operating in the red king crab savings area of the Bering Sea. Currently, that area is closed only to bottom trawling as a way to take immediate action, and that analysis will be discussed, and the council could decide to make a recommendation to the secretary to proceed with that emergency to become effective sometime in January. The council's also looking at coming forward with a work plan in December to look at other alternatives, in other ways to provide for the conservation of that stock. And there's a lot of factors that need to be evaluated in that work plan to figure out what what are the factors that are affecting the stock and causing it to decline and slowing down recovery. So that really are the two, in my mind, the two big things. They also requested that the industry work very hard to avoid crab this coming year, and not just bycatch, because not all the crab comes up in the net, but look at ways to avoid it just like they do with salmon, and take whatever action they can. So there are some immediate actions that are taken, and it will trickle down into quite probably some kind of a regulatory action in the future, but I can't tell you right now. I'll know more in December. And if you're interested, we could certainly come back with a report to this committee at some future point.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Witherall. Do you have any further questions, Angel? Okay. Ms. Carlson Van Dorn.
No, but thank you very much for that additional information. It's good to know. I mean, I think we're experiencing some really, really, really complex problems with very difficult solutions that haven't perhaps revealed themselves as of yet. But my concern is that there has a very high potential for very disproportionate negative impacts to some of these small boat, individually owned fishing families in Alaska especially. And I don't know many small fishing operations that can withstand a 6-year hiatus, let alone a 10-year one. And so I'm concerned that this sort of represents the double whammy knockout punch to some of these fishermen and these fishing families. And I would just ask the council, as you do your work, and certainly will, I'll keep it top of mind at the board level, and the federal fisheries managers to keep that, keep those interests prioritized as policies are made and as we look at some of these potential solutions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Carlson Van Dorn. Further comments or suggestions or questions? Andy?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it would also be helpful for the Board of Fish members to understand the rationale for not taking action at the last meeting for the council. And that really the rationale, there was two things in that really made us pause on taking emergency action at the last meeting. One of them was that the analysis that we had in front of us didn't tell us what the impacts of closing that area would be on salmon bycatch. And right now we're facing huge pressure from Western Alaska to not take any action that might increase dramatically salmon bycatch. And we will receive back in December that information, which was really the primary driver. And then when we sort of gamed out the timetable for taking action and how that might impact the crab fishery, the difference between taking an action without knowing the impacts at this meeting or waiting 2 months to take an action that we would know the impacts, it seemed like for all reasons that we make decisions that we would be better equipped to make a decision like that. The other reason was that that same information will be considered in December at taking a more comprehensive look at closing that area or other things that impact habitat and crab bycatch. Not limited to, but including other sectors that have high removals of bycatch. So I think when we get this work plan back in December and we're able to get the analysis back that gives us the impacts, there'll probably be a much clearer picture of what we're doing on the federal level to protect those fishermen and communities. It's just that this meeting kind of happened before we get that information. So I would expect that you will have a better idea of what we're doing by the end of our December meeting, which will be happening here in Anchorage.
Thank you, Andy. Further comments, questions? Angel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just quickly add on to that. Another significant area of discussion was the limited staff that the agency is dealing with right now, and some significant shortages in their ability to execute existing rulemaking, and we have a lot of issues in the queue right now. So I think another primary motivation for developing this work plan in the next 2 months was to really target the highest priority issues, and make sure that we're not tasking staff with items or research efforts that may lack the clarity needed to really hit the ground running. So we needed, I think the council members and others needed some time to work with SSC and industry, crab plan team to really coordinate what those efforts were going to look like in a more efficient manner, considering the staff limitations that we're facing.
Thank you. Ms. Carlson Van Dort.
No, thanks, and thanks, Andy, for that additional information, and it begs the question that I don't know if it's worthy of reconvening this committee at some point after December, or if it's just sort of a written summary report just to keep the board informed. I don't know, but, I mean, I would certainly appreciate that information. Thank you.
Further comments or suggestions? Seeing none, Kenny?
Yeah, I just would like to note that I think, you know, these joint meetings between the Board of Fish and the council are important, and I've been a part of several of these now, and I think, you know, especially during these unprecedented times, whether you're looking at crab or salmon issues in particular, but, you know, I think when we exchange information, this public forum is useful, that we exchange this information in public and we have an opportunity for public comment. So I would just urge executive directors Nelson and Witherall to consider that with this committee and put this committee to work for these kind of things so we can have these open public meetings. I think particularly where crab is concerned, we heard from the executive director of Alaska Bering Sea Crabbers on the huge impacts that these decisions that both bodies are making have, and I think it's going to be important that we can continue to meet and exchange information in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenny. And one other thing that came up at the last meeting, we have to go through the salmon FMP again due to a lawsuit. So that's another thing that got piled on us, and it's a very strict timetable. So we're going to have assets on that too. So that complicates things even a little bit further. Mr. Witherall.
Mr. Chairman, yes, I could certainly track those issues and provide an update for Art and the other Joint Protocol Committee members from the December meeting. And if it looks like we need to meet thereafter to discuss crab issues or cookingless salmon issues, we can certainly set up a meeting.
Okay, thank you. Okay, further comments? Okay, seeing none, is there a motion to adjourn? Second? Second. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Appreciate your attendance, and thanks for the staff reports. They were great.